Paul's already mentioned that I spent some time in America with William Eggleston, and that came about because in 1982 I came across William Eggleston's guide. I'm sure there must be people here who've seen the guide. It's very famous now. And as a young photographer who'd studied in the 70s in Manchester, sometimes it's kind of hard to convey to people in this situation just how difficult it was to get hold of other photographers' work in published form, and to see exhibitions of photography was extremely rare. The Photographers' Gallery had only started in 1971. And it was, if you were a student in Manchester, it was, and you weren't able to go to London all the time, it was a very sort of particular climate. So one would pounce on things. And obviously in '82, I'd come back and I'd left Hebden Bridge. I was back in Manchester, trying to find my feet, and I came across the guide. And as a student who'd been impressed by people like Ansel Adams and Weston, who, in a sense, were the only people you could be impressed by, because they were the only people you kind of had access to, because they were so revered and so advanced in either years or in terms of their career, that the money had been made available to publish their work, because that's very expensive. Eggleston's work was just, for me, it was unbelievable. I hadn't realized that photography could talk about the kinds of things, the kinds of experiences, the kinds of very, very subtle, fleeting nuances of consciousness in one's life. I thought everything had to be really kind of formal and largely black and white if you were serious, and so on. So Eggleston's pictures, which were very, very elliptical, complex, seemingly artless, but for me, and of course for other people like John Zukowski, who put on that amazing show of Eggleston's work in New York in '76, the work was extraordinary. And I guess what happened then was that I realized that I could see that if I was going to be an artist or a photographer, it doesn't really matter anymore, that I was going to have to be fairly brave. And it seemed to me that the one way of testing my bravery was ensuring that I actually approached Eggleston, because he was the one person in the world I was afraid of, and asking him if I could come and spend time with him. So, as luck would have it, and luck often plays a big part in these things, Martin Parr, who, as you know, I was friendly with, who was getting invitations to the V&A at the time, couldn't make the first ever Eggleston opening at the V&A. So he said, "Peter, you're pretty keen on Eggleston. Why didn't you take the invitation?" So it was 1983. To give you a sense of how raw and how early everything was, Eggleston, yeah, he did have work at the V&A, but he had about 24 prints, sort of, let's see, around about this sort of size, dye transfers, in mounts, in mats, simply propped up at a slight angle inside glass display cases in a corridor at the V&A, and that was Eggleston's show. But I had heard in advance that he was coming, and he did come, and I was there, and he arrives with a big hat and, all these kind of Americans, and I just waited for the right moment. I mean, it was very, very nerve-wracking. And probably about 15 minutes after he arrived, he made a break for the drinks table, and I went right over and introduced myself, which was probably one of the most difficult things I've ever had to do. And I said, "I think your work, Mr. Eggleston, I think your work is fantastic. Can I come and work with you?" So the first thing, which is really funny in this context, he asked me, he said, "Do you teach?" And at that point, I wasn't teaching. And I said, "No, I'm not." He said, "Okay, you can come," which has always struck me as quite amusing. He will have his own reasons for that response. I never really asked him. But the following year, so I went round to see him before he left London, and we made arrangements. And in '84, I went to spend time, something like about 8 or 9 weeks with Eggleston in Mississippi and Tennessee, which was a very curious and bizarre and extraordinary experience. While I was in the States with Eggleston, I saw an amazing film called Fanny and Alexander. Has anyone seen it? By Bergman. It's a pretty amazing film. Anyway, there's like a bishop who's always got this huge cross around his neck, and he's the embodiment of evil, it turns out, in the film. A really nasty piece of work. And when I came back from my time with Eggleston, I moved to Bristol, and I decided to try to make a series of pictures that suggested that, if you like, spiritual preoccupations were not the sole preserve of the church or of organized religion. So I decided, I was living in Bristol by this time, I was going to photograph along a journey, walking from, if you like, one of the prominent manifestations of Christianity in the contemporary environment, a cathedral, Bristol Cathedral, and I was going to walk the 45 miles to Glastonbury, which is where, according to tradition, the Christian faith was introduced into Great Britain, or certainly England. And I guess my feeling was I was going to photograph inside churches and also in all of the sort of everyday places along that route. And hopefully, when I put all the pictures up on the wall in an exhibition context, the viewer might have a sense that you didn't have to go to a church, even though I think churches are wonderful places, but that the insight that all of us have the capacity for, the potential for, to recognize that things are actually much more complicated and more miraculous than they might appear first time, can take place anywhere. And so these are some of the pictures which the photographer's gallery showed in Everyday Icons. This picture gave the subsequent book, which was effectively a collection of pictures from several different series, its title. And one of the things I've always loved about this picture, which, I guess it's kind of simple and straightforward, is the way that it's a fantastic illustration of what photography does absolutely brilliantly. In other words, photography delineates every point of information in the subject with democratic precision. So at first sight, these two buckets, which, with a glancing blow of view, can look very similar. But as soon as you start paying attention, you're able to drink in the differences between the buckets, precisely because of the way that photography does this very, very special thing. So for me, it's a pivotal picture. I think it's probably fair to invite you all, if you have questions as we go through, perhaps I should have said it a little bit earlier, that I'm perfectly happy for you to just let me know that you've got a question, because there may be some at the end, if I get lucky, but on the other hand, sometimes if you have a question and you don't ask it, it just disappears. So do feel that you can ask me a question. Okay, in 86, all of these dates, by the way, are when the works were actually put out into the world, not when I was necessarily making the pictures. And that becomes even more crucial a little bit later on, when there's quite a big gap, because sometimes it took 3 years after making the work before I was able to publish and show it. But in 86, I was given a fellowship in the Southwest, and I started making pictures. It was basically to let me work over a summer. And I was making photographs. I found myself making photographs which were very intense, very focused, getting rid of all extraneous information, detail, and basically choosing, an object or a pair of objects, like the boys or people in that case, and getting everything else out of the picture. And in a way, I was concentrating so much in the images that I began to think it might be quite interesting to put them together, almost like sort of Egyptian word pictures, hieroglyphics. And I did get very, very interested in this, because I also realized that up to this point, I'd been really enjoying the fact that in a single photograph, the information and what's important obviously lies within the four sides of the image. When you start putting photographs together like this, diptychs or triptychs, then the actual meaning in the work lies in those black spaces between the photographs, because that's where you, the viewer, are making those bridging connections between the pictures, and it's through that process that that single piece of work is going to begin to make sense to you. This was very, very exciting, I thought. These are just, the show was shown, I think, at a gallery called Watershed in Bristol, maybe some of you know, and these are some of the combinations which came out of that summer's work. That perhaps almost inevitably led on to triptychs, which were very much larger in scale. I should have mentioned, for example, those pictures we've just been looking at, they were all actually quite small, maybe about this sort of size. I don't know, 12, 18 at the most. But in '89, I began working with an art dealer called Maureen Paley. So each of these images is about 4 feet square. So a triptych would be really quite big, which brings its own problems. And with this work, I was particularly interested. I don't know how you all feel, but my feeling is that the size, the physical scale of the work should be determined by the internal logic in the work. And the previous series that I'd made in Bristol in the southwest, Towards an Absolute Zero, it seemed very, very appropriate that they were very, very sort of crystal jewel-like. But with these images, I felt that I wanted to make much more of the sculptural facets and dimensions of the objects being represented. So in other words, John Davis, this is the now famous British photographer John Davis. We're on holiday in the south of France. And in the actual image, I mean, he's going to be life-size or something of that order. The middle picture, just in case you can't make it out, it's a shed in the forest, very close to Aberystwyth, actually, covered in plastic sheeting, so it keeps it dry in the rain. And the little red thing in the middle picture, near the bottom, is a broken piece of a car stoplight. In 1990, I was invited to be the British artist in residence in Marseille, which basically meant that I could have an apartment and a small amount of money, not a great deal of money, but it was a huge sort of cultural event, and there were artists from all kinds of countries from around the world being invited to come and make work. I drove down. I had been to the Mediterranean before, but I was still kind of shocked with, it was like July or something, so incredibly hot. And most of you know what happens in a hot climate. When the ground heats up to a certain level, you get, the air gets really hot and it starts shimmering. So it becomes harder and harder to actually see things, well, sharp. And after, this is the catalogue, this took 3 years from shooting to showing and publishing. That was St. Louis Art Gallery, I think they showed it. After a while, I realized that what was really interesting was what I wanted the subject of the work to be was the space around objects and between them. But you can't just photograph thin air. So there's a causal relationship in all these pictures between a subject and, if you like, the apparent subject and the actual subject that interests me, which is the space around and between objects. Working with the Rolleiflex, so that the twin lens reflex, you look down, and the viewing lens has got you can't change the aperture, so it's got a very narrow depth of field, which was perfect for this, absolutely perfect. And when exhibited, these were all about 4 feet square, again, 4 feet square. I've just had a shower. There is a kind of weird mottling effect going on here, which I've never seen before, and I do hope it's not really destroying any pleasure you might possibly be getting. Ah. That's not actually quite as crazily bright as that, say, for example, on the wall. Okay, so it took till '93 to show that work, and I showed it at Corner House and the James Hockey Gallery, which was down in Farnham.